I'm going to have to start with an admission that Riyoko and I are still doing something that's quite new to us here. We're talking about an ongoing, evolving situation which has perhaps become more critical and important than since we began work on the response to the announced closure of Grangemouth Refinery last year. We're historians. We usually talk about things that are long past when it comes to the closure of workplaces, but I expect much of the audience has been galvanised to attend today because last week redundancy notices were handed out to more than 400 refinery workers at Grangemouth, and the owners, Petroineos, confirmed that they intend to go ahead with the closure as soon as May, so just a few weeks' time. We're going to present today some research that we completed last year for the Just Transition Commission, an independent advisory body to the Scottish Government, where we interviewed a number of workers at Grangemouth following the announcement of the refinery closure. And we're going to understand how the Grangemouth workers conceive of a just transition, what they think a fair future looks like, and why they think the announced closure is a particularly egregious, unfair and unjust outcome. We're going to take slide about, so you'll hear from Riyoko, and they're going to start by just positioning Grangemouth geographically and economically.
So for those who aren't familiar, Grangemouth is an oil and petrochemical town in Scotland's central belt, between Glasgow and Edinburgh. You can see the town outlined in red just by Falkirk, by the River Forth.
So Grangemouth is now a town of around 16,000 people, according to the most recent census. If you've ever driven down the M8 between Glasgow and Edinburgh, or even more so got the fast train between Glasgow and Edinburgh, you might have seen the large cooling towers at Grangemouth, which are probably the most memorable sight in the town. Those cooling towers are significant to the story we're exploring today. Grangemouth is home to Scotland's largest and also final oil refinery, so it's a crucial part of Scotland and indeed the UK's energy infrastructure. It's one of only 6 remaining oil refineries. Grangemouth is also, though, a wider petrochemicals and oil-based hub, and I think it's important to set out some parameters of what that involves. So, petrochemicals, crucial feedstocks for manufacturing, are made at Grangemouth. Oil is refined at Grangemouth, and oil is also processed from the Forties pipeline system, so oil is drilled from the North Sea, and then exported onto tanker at Hound Point, which I actually caught a glimpse of this morning when I was going across the Forth Bridge. The Hound Point platform is just to the southern side of the Firth of Forth. The reason I bring this up is I think there's a lot of confusion in political discussion around Grangemouth and the refinery. The refinery is in some ways linked but also distinctive from those other activities. It's owned by a separate vehicle, Petroineos, which is a venture between the petrochemicals firm Ineos, owned by a majority shareholder, Sir Jim Ratcliffe, and Petrochina, a state-owned Chinese oil company, which is a part of one of the largest oil companies in the world. Ineos separately have interest in the chemical business and also in the processing side, the Kinneil terminal where the oil from the North Sea is processed. The oil that is refined at Grangemouth is actually largely imported, usually via the Finnark terminal on the west coast of Scotland, whose future is also in question as a result of the announced closure of the refinery in November 2023. Petroineos announced that the refinery would be replaced with an import terminal. Effectively, this is continuing a large visible trend in European energy economics, where Europe is becoming increasingly dependent on importing refined products, often from the Middle East, Asia, and until recently, Russia. More than 400 jobs at the refinery are directly at risk, hence the issuing of redundancy notices last week. But it's important to recognise the scale of the threat to employment here. More than double that, probably, workforce is threatened at the site in terms of regular contract work. So the contract workforce is considerably bigger than the direct core workforce. That includes a powerful base of skilled trades workers who are also threatened in terms of their future, but also a supply chain of firms in the local area. A report last year issued by PwC on behalf of the Scottish Government estimated that approaching 3,000 jobs depend on oil refining at Grangemouth, and that these are concentrated strongly in the Grangemouth, Falkirk, Bo'ness area. So as a result of these factors, as a result of Grangemouth's visibility and importance, it was described in 2023 and 2024 as a litmus test by trade union leaders of Scotland's, the Scottish Government's, and indeed the incoming Labour UK Government's commitment to a just transition. But this year, at a recent hearing of the Scottish Committee at Westminster, Richard Harvey, a long-standing member of the Just Transition Commission and an official of the Prospect Union in Scotland, who's worked through several major energy workplace closures in the past, described that the key lesson at Grangemouth for the future was not to do it like it's been done at Grangemouth. This had been a particularly negative experience in comparison with other workplace closures, such as the closure of Long Annet Power Station across the Firth of Forth and Fife, which Richard also worked through. So we're just going to introduce ourselves in a wee bit more depth now, Riyoko, if you want to go ahead.
My research centres on the history of Grangemouth and its petroleum industries since 1950 under British Petroleum. And the main thing I look at is the long history of environmental injustice and the intertwined history between labour and environmental issues. Yeah, this is something that we're seeing a continuation of today with labour-centred calls for a just transition.
I wrote a PhD in my first book on the end of coal mining in Scotland. Understanding this is a long process that unfolded across the second half of the 20th century. My expertise lies in understanding how structural changes to the energy economy are shaped by the decisions of government and multinational enterprises, but also how those experiences are contested, objected to, and shaped from below by workers and communities, and how they've been historically understood, particularly in localities such as Grangemouth, that have been at the forefront of a series of ongoing transformations. So using these skills, our historical skill base, we wrote a report for the Just Transition Commission in 2024, the Grangemouth Refinery Closure Workers' Perspectives. We also next month have an article going to be published by the Journal of the British Academy on the closure, understanding on the one hand how workers' perspectives but also policy making has developed in response to the articulation of a just transition agenda for the transition towards renewables in Scotland since the late 2010s. So Riyoko will now introduce the bearing that historical experience has on our approach towards Grangemouth.
The work that you've just mentioned and what we're presenting today is based off research conducted last year in January 2024. Ewan and I interviewed 8 workers employed by INEOS and Petroineos at the refinery, petrochemical complex and the oil terminals connected to the refinery. Grangemouth and its refinery has been central to the British energy economy. It was opened 100 years ago in 1924 by British Petroleum. And then following World War II, there was major expansion of the refinery and also the commissioning of Europe's first petrochemical plant. Then in the 1970s, while other industrial communities in Scotland were experiencing contested contraction and closure, Grangemouth actually saw further expansion with North Sea oil developments. Though experiencing job losses, the refinery was kept open, and then in 2005, BP sold the whole complex to INEOS, a private multinational petrochemical company. Grangemouth has remained a central industrial hub for Scotland and Britain. This history was really important to how workers experienced the closure, and it's something we were able to capture as historians who use oral history in our methods. When interviewing workers, we situated their perspectives on the current issues within their life histories. The timing was also unique. This was immediately after the closure announcement, but before concrete decisions were made about the site by employers, the union and the government. And through this, we were able to pull out place and prior experience of industrial change as crucial to workers' conceptualisation of justice and injustice.
One of the dominant themes that emerged in our interviews was the relationship between living and working in Grangemouth, connections between community, place, and employment in refining and petrochemicals, particularly in the context of the larger experience of deindustrialisation, of manufacturing, plant closures and job losses in Scotland since the late 20th century. I should say that the vast majority of our interviewees requested to remain anonymous in the context of a contentious closure situation and a history of hostility between employers and the trade union movement at the plant as well. So we're presenting these quotes anonymously, giving pretty limited biographical detail on each worker. So we've got two quotes here that I think exemplify these important, strong, ongoing connections about what it meant to work in petrochemicals and refining in Grangemouth. So the first one was from a worker in their 40s who described that they felt there was a strong connection and respect between workers at the plant, the community, and connected to their role in the local economy. They described leaving work and finding in an evening that the main shopping precinct in Grangemouth would be a sea of orange boiler suits, that you could visibly see the contribution of the plant through the uniforms of the workforce and the money that they were spending in local shops. The second quote came from a worker who was perhaps around 10 years younger. They completed an apprenticeship at Grangemouth, and they described this as a sought-after premium position that their classmates towards the end of secondary school looked for the opportunity to become apprentices at the refinery or the petrochemicals works. And they described this as a very positive, confidence-building, skill-building experience that around 10 years after starting their apprenticeship, they were a full-time employee, and that they looked around them in the workplace and saw a number of fellow colleagues who'd worked through a similar process. So the refinery and the petrochemicals works remain a key centre of sought-after, comparatively secure, skilled jobs.
So on the day of announcement in September 2023, workers were called into a meeting and were told that the refinery was going to close by spring 2025. Workers were shocked and described feeling quite unsettled at how abrupt the decision was. One shop steward told us that there was never any clear indication or signal from the company before the announcement was made that they were even aiming to become a distribution terminal. At the core of this reaction was the sense that workers weren't consulted or deliberated on big decisions, which was rooted in the lack of accountability and the ownership structures of their workplace. Grangemouth highlights patterns of ownership in the oil and gas industry dependent on privately owned companies which lack accountability. The refinery, as Ewan mentioned, is run by a joint partnership between Ineos with Jim Ratcliffe, the CEO and majority shareholder, and Petrochina, a Chinese state-owned oil company. Geographical distance adds further complexity to the story of shock. This picture that you see in the slides is the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs, Angus Robertson, On 24th of November 2023, just 2 months after the closure was announced, he met with senior representatives from PetroChina in Beijing to discuss the future of Grangemouth. Workers' feeling of shock were informed by these owner structures, with one telling us that the decision seemed to be made elsewhere, and another distinguishing between local decisions where plant-level management might be consulted, and then big decisions like the refinery closure made in board decisions in boardrooms on the other side of the world.
This sense of shock, surprise, and having not been consulted or deliberated with when it came to the closure also compounded a further sense of betrayal, of being let down, given previous promises that the workforce felt had been made to them by management in the years immediately preceding the closure announcement in 2023. These had involved sacrifices on the part of the workforce. These sacrifices took two quite important forms. So the first was agreement to a restructuring in 2020, which was a painful experience. It involved 200 refinery worker redundancies that came about from the closure of two plants, a crude oil distillation unit and a catalytic cracking unit. These were seen as necessary to secure an economically viable future for the refinery as a whole, and they were also prefigured by the collapse in oil price in 2020. You might remember there was that stage in the early days of COVID where you were, in theory, able to be paid money to take a barrel of oil. That was around this sort of time. There was very real worry about the price of oil and its long-term future. But the other side of this was the sense also, which workers felt had been encouraged by management, that there was a long-term future for the plant, that alongside running down these elements of oil refining activity, there was going to be new investment. The German electricity generator RWE, for instance, have discussed building a green hydrogen-powered power station to power the larger site. There's been discussed. Petroineos announced this Grangemouth Renaissance project, which included our orientation towards hydrogen activities too. So there was a discussion of movement towards greener forms of manufacturing and energy production. And one worker told us that they were actually swayed by management not to leave the site, to stay loyal to Petroineos because of this long-term future, billions of pounds worth of investment. And they concretised that. They said that they were told not to go across the Firth of Forth to work at Mossmorran, Scotland's other large petrochemical site, and to stay at Grangemouth because keeping this team together was important to keeping the site competitive and functioning. Riyoko is now going to move on to explain how we understand the worker perspective on what a just transition or a fair future for Grangemouth could look like.
Just transition is a concept that has grown in popularity since around the 2010s, essentially advocating for a transition away from fossil fuel production to green energy, and one that does not leave fossil fuel workers behind. Some workers we spoke to had heard of just transition in this context, and some had not. And of those who had, it was in the context of government policy commitments, and generally associated with outside forces, rather than a framing centering workers and trade unionism. But workers' experience of shock and betrayal and unjust procedures and outcomes through which the refinery closure was announced informed a worker-centred articulation of justice. This involved collaboration and consultation with the workforce, keeping the refinery open. This is captured in Unite's Keep Grangemouth Working campaign, planning for the jobs gap to retain local jobs between the closure and green proposals and also fulfilling promises made during the 2020 restructure, which Ewan just went over. Justice also centred on, of course, climate justice with, for instance, net zero targets, including actionable and accountable targets for green investment linked with job creation in the local area. We'll go into the detail of this in the following 2 or 3 slides.
I think one of the key spurs of the worker sense of injustice related to the sense of waste of their skills and local potential. This graphic is another production from Unite, the main union at the plant's Keep Grangemouth Working campaign, which was produced last week as redundancy notices were issued, and it explained that the cost of the closure and redundancy without a transition for the workforce will mean energy security, a lost local tax base, and the loss of skills which workers will take with them as they migrate to potentially other parts of the world. There was a sense here of Grangemouth's place in the UK and Scotland's energy economy needing to be historically reciprocated, that the town and its workforce had made an important contribution through a century of refining, which ought to be reciprocated now through national support to develop the site so that it could continue to play an important role in greening manufacturing. This related both to the material outcomes and welfare of the workforce and the locality, but it also related, I think, to a more intrinsic sense of what it meant to be a skilled worker, to have invested in an apprenticeship and developing skills and being assessed and appraised as such by employers after that. For these to be discarded was seen as inherently wasteful and unjust, and taking away the recognition and status that these workers had achieved, not just in financial terms, but also in moral and social recognition terms. There was a strong sense that these skills were transitionable, that these workers were actually keen to be part of a greening transition, but also a strongly localist understanding of justice. On the one hand, Grangemouth is a node in international and national flows of energy, but it's also a key site of localised prosperity and employment. And I think importantly here, there's also then a scripting of Grangemouth in which energy employment is synonymous with prosperity and the future, rather than synonymous with a distant past, and Grangemouth being associated now with patterns of unemployment and deprivation. So there's an articulation here of what green energy means, what commitments to a just transition mean, but also a claim on what Grangemouth means. And Riyoko will now explain this in relationship to how workers articulated their views of climate change.
Yeah, so in Scotland, environmental justice and energy worker activism are quite interrelated. An example of this is the Scottish Just Transition Commission, which comprises of union and environmental representatives. The coalitions fostered by the Scottish Just Transition context have helped align workers and environmentalists in recognising common ground and their interdependent causes. We saw this in worker responses to expectations of energy transition in Grangemouth. Many workers expressed that the shift away from fossil fuel production that they were part of was a necessary and important step. One interviewee said quite evocatively, "We're not dinosaurs," and expressed recognition that times are changing. And in this new context of the climate crisis, the refinery had a shelf life. Workers anticipated energy transition would happen in their lifetimes and in their careers. And as Ewan has just spoken about, as highly skilled workers, they also felt that they had the skills to be part of this green transition. Although they wanted this, workers expressed a void between the refinery closure and net zero targets of 2030 and 2045. These timelines are long-term and have little accountability for the fossil fuel sector to actually abide by them. So for workers, climate justice was articulated as these targets, specifying milestones for linking jobs with green investment. This quote here, I think, summarises that connection quite nicely. One worker said that they don't want to come across like they're climate change deniers, and rather this being a question of being for or against the green agenda, it's actually about an argument of whether people are for or against jobs in manufacturing.
What we think Grangemouth encapsulates is the need to understand how the case of a just transition is understood within particular local examples, especially in key production hubs within the energy economy. In the context of Grangemouth, the meaning of a just transition, particularly, but not only for the unionised workforce, is labour-centred. It relates to establishing mechanisms to continue skilled energy sector employment. There's disappointment on the one hand with employers, but I think more strongly with government, frankly, in these interviews. There's a sense that employers of the nature of Petroineos are operating ultimately for profit in global energy markets. There was an expectation that the Scottish Government and the UK Government would operate in the interests of manufacturing capacity, which workers felt was not being fulfilled. This disappointment was grounded in a procedural dynamic in terms of the sense of there having not been due deliberation and planning around closure, but also pivotally a distributional one around the absence of a concretised plan to maintain employment in Grangemouth, and the danger, indeed, that workers were going to be forced to either accept much less well-rewarded jobs or to leave Grangemouth in Scotland, perhaps to go and work in the Middle East or in Asia and the Pacific region. These understandings of justice were conditioned by a sense of history and place, by Grangemouth's survival as a key industrial site amid the longer deleterious experience of the effects of deindustrialisation in Scotland since the late 20th century. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to your questions.